There are losses that the world prepares you for. The death of a husband after 51 years of marriage is one of the things people tell you to expect, tell you to brace for, tell you will come eventually if you live long enough and love deeply enough. They tell you grief is a process. They tell you time is generous. They tell you that the people who love you will hold you through it. What nobody tells you, what no one thinks to mention in all the careful conversations about loss and healing and a slow return of ordinary life, is that the people who are supposed to hold you through it can sometimes become the very thing you need to survive. Ruth Elaine Harmon learned this on a Tuesday in March, 8 days after she buried her husband, standing in her own kitchen in a house she had lived in for 43 years, watching her eldest daughter carry boxes out the front door like she was clearing a space she had already decided was hers. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Ruth's full name was Ruth Elaine Dempsey before she became a Harmon, and she had been born on a warm June morning in 1947 in Calverton, a town so small in the hill country of Western Virginia that most maps of the state simply left it off entirely, as if the cartographers had agreed by consensus that certain places existed more as feelings than as facts. She was the third of 5 children raised by a father who worked the county roads for 30 years and a mother who taught herself to sew well enough that half the women in Calverton wore dresses she had made on a machine that sat in the corner of the living room and ran from 7 in the morning until the light in the windows gave out. Ruth had grown up in a house full of noise and motion and the particular warmth of a family that did not have much but distributed what it had with an even-handedness that meant no one ever felt the shortage in any way that mattered. She had been a quiet child in a loud household, which had taught her early the particular skill of observing carefully and speaking only when she had something worth saying. This was a quality that had served her well throughout her life and that her daughter Vivian had always interpreted, incorrectly, as weakness. She had met Leonard Harmon at a church social in the summer of 1968, when she was 21 and he was 24 and recently returned from a year working construction in Maryland that had given him the kind of steady, grounded confidence that comes to young men who have been out in the world long enough to understand that they can handle it. Leonard was not a man who filled rooms the way some men did, not loud or expansive or given to the kind of performance of personality that announced itself before it arrived. He was quiet the way Ruth was quiet, attentive in the way that genuinely attentive people are, with the full and unhurried quality of someone who had decided that the person in front of them was worth their complete attention and meant it entirely. Ruth had spoken to him for 40 minutes at that church social and gone home knowing something she had never known before that particular evening about herself, which was that she had been waiting, without fully realizing it, for someone to listen to her the way he had. They were married 11 months later in a ceremony at First Baptist that her mother cried through from beginning to end and that her father marked by shaking Leonard's hand with both of his own in the way of men who express everything they feel through the pressure of a grip. What followed was 51 years of a life built together on the kind of foundation that is neither dramatic nor fragile, but solid in the way that things built slowly and with consistent care tend to be solid. Leonard worked for the County Public Works Department for 32 years, rising from equipment operator to district supervisor in the unhurried way of a man who was excellent at his work without ever needing anyone to make a fuss about it. Ruth raised their children and kept the house on Meridian Lane and worked part-time for 20 years at the elementary school library, a job she had loved with a specificity and sincerity that her children had always found mildly puzzling, because it was not glamorous work and it did not pay well, and yet she spoke of it with the quiet satisfaction of someone doing exactly what she was meant to do. She had shelved books and read to children and helped young people find stories they hadn't known they needed, and she had done it with the same consistent, uncelebrated care she had brought to everything in her life. They had 3 children. Vivian, the eldest, born in 1970, who had always had her father's practicality without his gentleness, sharp and efficient and possessed from an early age of the conviction that things ought to be managed correctly and that she was generally the most qualified person in any given room to do the managing. Michael, born in 1973, who had moved to Colorado in his late 20s and built a life there that was genuinely good but genuinely distant, the kind of distance that is not unfriendly but that accumulates over years into a gap that good intentions alone cannot bridge. And Carolyn, the youngest, born in 1977, gentle and warm and living 40 minutes away in Halford with her husband and her 2 teenage boys, who came to Sunday dinners and called on Tuesdays, and was the child who most resembled Ruth in the quality of her attention and the steadiness of her presence. The house on Meridian Lane was a craftsman bungalow built in 1941 by a man named Greer, who had put into it the kind of care that people brought to houses in that era, when the expectation was that a structure would outlast its builder and should therefore be worthy of doing so. It had wide front porch boards and deep eaves and original hardwood floors throughout that had darkened beautifully over 80 years into the color of strong tea. The kitchen had been updated twice, once in the 1970s when they had first bought it and the avocado appliances were considered modern, and again in the early 2000s when Leonard had spent a summer installing new cabinets himself with the methodical patience he brought to everything he built. The basement was original, stone-walled and low-ceilinged, accessible from a door in the kitchen that Ruth had always used for storage, where the Christmas decorations lived in their labeled plastic bins alongside the canning jars from years when she had still canned and the old toolboxes of Leonard's that she couldn't bring herself to move after he was gone. Leonard had died on a Thursday morning in February after a brief and vicious illness that had moved faster than any of them were prepared for. He had been fine in December, or fine enough, the particular fine of a man in his late 70s who moved a little more slowly than he once had and tired a little more easily and had learned to manage his heart medication with the same methodical attention he had always brought to things that required it. He had been diagnosed in January. He was gone in February. The 6 weeks between those two facts had the quality of something Ruth still could not think about in its full shape, because its full shape was too large to hold all at once, too heavy to carry without setting part of it down. The funeral had been on a Saturday, attended by more people than Ruth had expected, which had moved her in ways she still found difficult to articulate, the evidence of a life that had touched more people than its living had ever required to advertise itself. Leonard's colleagues from the county. Neighbors from Meridian Lane going back 30 years. The men from his Saturday morning coffee group at the diner on Route 9 who came in a cluster and stood together at the back of the church with the particular solemnity of men who did not cry easily but who needed to be present in the way that you need to be present for the loss of someone who has been a fixture of your ordinary life for decades. Vivian had taken charge of the arrangements, which was what Vivian did. She was efficient and thorough, and she moved through the logistics of a funeral the way she moved through everything, with the focused energy of a woman who believes that her competence is a form of love and that managing the details well is the most meaningful contribution she can offer. Ruth had been grateful, genuinely, because in those first days after Leonard's death she had not been capable of managing details. She had been capable of sitting in the chair by the bedroom window and looking at the yard and existing within the specific hollow that opened up inside you when the person who had been your constant companion for 51 years was no longer in the next room, no longer coming down the stairs in the morning, no longer there. Carolyn stayed with her the first week. Michael flew in from Colorado for the service and stayed 4 days before his job pulled him back, which Ruth understood and did not hold against him, because she knew Michael and she knew that distance was how he protected himself from the size of things, and that the protection was necessary rather than heartless. Carolyn was the one who sat with her in the evenings and made sure she ate and drove her to the pharmacy for the medication adjustment her doctor recommended for the grief-related spike in her blood pressure, and Ruth felt in her youngest daughter's presence the specific comfort of being known by someone who did not need you to explain yourself. But Carolyn went home after a week, because she had her boys and her husband and her own life that needed tending, and Ruth understood this too, and told her clearly to go, because asking people to stay past the point of what their lives could absorb was not something Ruth Elaine Harmon did. She could manage. She had always managed. She made her coffee in the morning and she fed the bird feeder in the backyard and she answered the sympathy cards that arrived in the mailbox and she did what she had always done, which was show up to the ordinary business of each day and get through it with the particular stubborn steadiness of a woman who had been raised not to make a fuss about hard things. Vivian returned on a Tuesday. Ruth heard the car in the driveway at 8:30 in the morning, which was not unusual for Vivian, who began her days early and expected the world to match her pace. What was slightly unusual was the second car that pulled in behind Vivian's, a larger vehicle, The kind of vehicle you rented when you needed to transport volume rather than simply people. Ruth stood at the kitchen window and watched Vivian get out and speak briefly to the young man driving the second car before coming up the porch steps, and felt something shift in the air around her with the specific quality of a shift she did not yet have the full information to name. Vivian came in without knocking, which she never did, because Vivian considered the house on Meridian Lane an extension of family space rather than private property in the way that implied permission was required. She was dressed in the kind of efficient clothing she favored, dark trousers and a practical jacket, her hair pulled back, her expression arranged in the combination of warmth and purpose that Ruth had been reading on her eldest daughter's face since Vivian was 12 years old and had decided she understood how things ought to be organized better than anyone else in the room. She kissed Ruth's cheek and accepted the cup of coffee Ruth poured before she'd been asked, and sat at the kitchen table with the upright posture of a woman who does not lean back in chairs when there is something to be addressed. Ruth sat across from her and wrapped her hands around her own cup. And waited. "There are some things you handle better at the table," Vivian said, which was an unusual beginning even for Vivian, who generally moved to her point without preamble. She meant the house. Ruth understood this immediately, in the way you understand things your body has already processed before your mind has caught up to them. She meant the house and what came next and the decisions she had already made about both. It was too big for one person. Ruth had heard this before. Not from Vivian specifically, but from the general chorus of people who believed that the size of the space a person lived in should correlate precisely with the number of people living in it, as if rooms had a minimum occupancy and a house lived in by one person was a kind of extravagance or a kind of danger or both simultaneously. The house was 4 bedrooms and a full basement and a yard that required attention and a porch that needed repainting and heating costs in the winter that were, Vivian said carefully, not inconsiderable. Ruth listened. She had been listening to Vivian carefully her entire life. What Vivian proposed was not presented as a proposal. This was the thing Ruth would understand more clearly as the morning progressed, that what she was sitting through was not a conversation but an announcement, the kind of announcement that had been constructed in advance and required only her attendance rather than her input. Vivian had spoken to a realtor. The house on Meridian Lane was a seller's market, she said, with the particular confidence of a woman who had done research. There was a senior community in Harfield, 40 minutes away, that had an excellent reputation and an opening and that Carolyn had also looked at, because apparently Carolyn had been involved in this planning in ways that she had not mentioned during the week she had spent sitting with Ruth in the evenings making sure she ate. The young man in the rental vehicle, it turned out, was there for the furniture. Vivian had arranged for certain pieces to be transported to her own home for safekeeping, her word, safekeeping, which Ruth had always thought was a word that told you exactly what you needed to know about the person using it, because things are only in need of keeping safe from someone, and in this case the someone was not hard to identify. Leonard's desk from the study. The dining room set that had been Ruth's mother's, solid mahogany with the particular weight of things built in an era that expected furniture to outlast its owners. Several of the better pieces from the living room. The china cabinet. Ruth sat at her kitchen table and watched her daughter explain all of this with the careful efficiency of a woman who had convinced herself that efficiency was the same thing as care, and she felt the hollow inside her from Leonard's absence extend itself in a new direction, not deeper but wider, taking in territory she had not expected to lose yet. She said very little. This was not because she had nothing to say. Ruth Elaine Harmon had quite a lot to say, and she was aware of this with the steady clarity of a woman who has learned over the course of a long life that the timing of what you say matters as much as the content of it. She said she needed to think. She said she was tired, which was true. She said she appreciated Vivian's concern, which was also true, in the complicated way that things can be true without being the whole truth. Vivian took this for agreement, because Vivian generally took the absence of explicit opposition for agreement, and by noon the rental vehicle was loaded with the dining room furniture and Leonard's desk and several boxes of things that Vivian had determined required safekeeping, and Ruth stood on the front porch of her house on Meridian Lane and watched it all go with her hands folded and her face composed and the particular stillness of a woman who is processing something large enough that any external movement would be inadequate to contain it. She called Carolyn that evening. There was a silence on the phone when Ruth finished describing the morning, the kind of silence that tells you the person on the other end is not surprised and is deciding what to do with the fact that they are not surprised. Carolyn said that she and Vivian had talked, that she had thought they were just exploring options, that she hadn't known Vivian was going to move so quickly. Ruth listened to this and understood it to be partially true, which was the most accurate thing she could say about it, and she told Carolyn she was not angry, which was also partially true in ways she didn't have the energy to fully examine that evening. What she was, more precisely, was certain. She became certain on the porch of her house that Tuesday noon watching the rental vehicle pull away from Meridian Lane, in the same way she had become certain of other things throughout her life at the moments that required it, with the quiet completeness of a woman who has reached the end of accommodation and found something harder and more reliable underneath it. She was not going to the senior community in Harfield. She was not leaving Meridian Lane on Vivian's timeline or anyone else's. She was 77 years old and she had lived in this house for 43 years and raised 3 children in it and kept it with her own 2 hands through all the seasons of a long marriage, and she was not going to be managed out of it because her daughter had spoken to a realtor and arranged a rental vehicle for a Tuesday. What she was going to do instead she did not yet fully know. She only knew that it was going to be her decision, made in her own time, in the house that was still hers for as long as it remained hers, and that whatever came next would come from her own choosing rather than from anyone else's arrangement of her circumstances. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark listening to the house settle around her the way it had settled around her for decades, the specific language of an old structure, the creaks and sighs of timber that has been standing long enough to have a voice of its own. Leonard had known the sounds of this house the way he knew all things he had lived with long and loved, by feel, without needing to name them. She lay in the dark and missed him with a completeness that had no adequate description and felt the house breathe around her in the dark and told herself what she had always told herself in the difficult moments of her life. She would figure it out. She always had. The weeks that followed had the quality of a negotiation, though negotiation was not exactly the right word because negotiation implies 2 parties with comparable degrees of power and comparable access to information, and this was not quite what Ruth and Vivian were working with. Vivian had the momentum of having already begun, the realtor appointment scheduled, the Harfield community brochure left prominently on Ruth's kitchen counter, the furniture already at her own house where it could be said to be in safekeeping until everything was settled. She had also the particular momentum of a person who believes she is acting reasonably and for the right reasons, which is the most difficult kind of momentum to interrupt because the person generating it is usually not conscious of what it is doing. Ruth had something different. She had time, which she used deliberately. She had the specific knowledge of a woman who has lived in a house for 43 years and knows every corner of it in ways that people who have only visited it cannot, and it was this knowledge, applied one quiet morning in the 3rd week after the funeral, that changed everything. She had been in the basement. Not for the first time since Leonard died, she had been down for the Christmas boxes in December without thinking anything of it, but for the first time since December, and she was down there with the specific purpose of assessing what was actually hers and what might have migrated into the category of things Vivian considered appropriate for safekeeping. And she was moving between the shelving units along the south wall when she noticed something she had never noticed in 43 years of living in this house, which was not because it had not been there, but because she had never looked at that particular section of wall in that particular way on a morning when the light from the small basement window was coming in at the angle it was coming in at on that specific day in March. The south wall of the basement, behind the last shelving unit, was not the same stone as the rest of it. Ruth stood very still and looked at it. She was not a woman who dramatized things, not even to herself, and she looked at the wall the way she looked at most things, with the patient and thorough attention of someone who wants to understand accurately before she decides what to feel. The stone of the main basement walls was rough-cut limestone fitted without mortar in the fashion of a 19th-century foundation, which was what the house's original structure rested on. The section behind the shelving unit was also stone, but different in character, the cuts more regular, the fitting more deliberate, and in the lower left corner, mostly hidden behind the leg of the shelving unit, an irregularity that Ruth looked at for a long time before she was able to name it to her own satisfaction. It was a seam. A vertical seam in the stone, running from the basement floor to a height of approximately 6 feet, at which point it met a horizontal seam running across the width of the section. It was the outline of a door. It was, unmistakably, the outline of a door, cut into the stone wall of her basement with a precision that suggested intention rather than accident, and sealed, as far as she could tell, from this side. Ruth reached out and placed her hand flat against the stone. It was cool and dry and absolutely solid, and it did not move when she pressed it, and she had no idea in that moment what was on the other side of it or how long it had been sealed or why anyone had done the sealing or what Leonard, who had known this house better than anyone, had known or not known about it. What she knew, standing in her basement with her palm flat against a door that had no handle and had perhaps been sealed for longer than she had been alive, was that the house on Meridian Lane had just become considerably more interesting than a realtor's market assessment could account for. And that whatever was behind that wall was hers. Whatever it was hers. She did not tell Vivian. This was the first decision she made in the basement, with her hand against the stone, before she had moved a single other thing or made a single other plan. She did not tell Vivian, and she did not tell Michael, and she told Carolyn only that she had found something in the house that she needed a little more time to understand before she was ready to talk about it, which Carolyn accepted without pressing because Carolyn understood the difference between urgency and its imitation. What Ruth did instead was go upstairs and make herself a cup of coffee and sit at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, the way she had always approached things that required thinking through, and she began to write down what she knew and what she needed to find out and who she might talk to without opening any door she wasn't ready to open yet. The legal pad filled slowly and carefully in her even handwriting, and outside the window of the house on Meridian Lane the March light was changing, moving towards something warmer, and the first suggestions of what would eventually become spring were beginning to arrive in the yard that Leonard had tended for decades and that Ruth was now tending alone. She had 43 years of life in this house. She had the knowledge of every room and every wall and every peculiarity of a structure that had been standing since 1941 and had been keeping its secrets, apparently, for at least that long. She had the patience of a woman who had learned over a long life that the things worth finding were rarely found by people in a hurry. And she had, in the basement of her own home, behind a shelving unit full of Christmas decorations and old toolboxes, a door that no one had apparently opened in a very long time, waiting. Ruth Elaine Harmon finished her coffee. She looked at the legal pad. Then she picked up the phone and called James Pelham, who had been Leonard's lawyer for 20 years and who had, as it happened, one specific piece of information about the house on Meridian Lane that neither Ruth nor Vivian nor anyone else in the family had ever thought to ask about, because no one had ever had a reason to ask. Until now. James Pelham had been a lawyer in Calverton County for 38 years, long enough that the town had stopped thinking of him as a professional and started thinking of him as a fixture, the way you think of the water tower or the old post office on Clement Street, things so consistently present in the landscape of ordinary life that their absence would require a significant adjustment to your sense of what the world was supposed to look like. He was 71 years old, semi-retired in the way that meant he still kept an office and still answered the phone and still handled the affairs of the families he had been handling for decades because he had not yet figured out what it would mean to stop and did not particularly want to figure it out yet. He had handled Leonard Harmon's estate planning for 20 years, and he had attended Leonard's funeral on the Saturday in February, standing near the back with his hat in his hands, and he had shaken Ruth's hand afterward with the particular gravity of a man who understood that this particular loss was larger than the usual category of loss. He answered on the second ring. Ruth told him what she had found. She described the basement wall and the seam in the stone and the outline of the door with the specific, careful precision she brought to all things that required accuracy, and James Pelham listened without interrupting in the way of a man who has learned that the most useful thing he can offer in most situations is his full attention. When she finished there was a pause that was not the pause of someone who had nothing to say but the pause of someone deciding how much of what they knew was now relevant. "There is something in the deed," he said finally, "that Leonard and I discussed when he first bought the house. Something I haven't thought about in years, to be honest, because it seemed academic at the time." Ruth waited. The house on Meridian Lane had been built in 1941 by a man named Arthur Greer, who had purchased the land from an estate in 1939, the estate of a family named Calloway who had owned that particular parcel since the late 1800s. The Calloways had been a prominent family in Calvert County in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the kind of family whose name appeared on the deeds and the church records and the civic committees of a certain era, substantial without being wealthy in any dramatic sense, rooted in the particular way of families who have been in a place long enough that the place has grown around them like a tree growing around a fence post. They had farmed the land and built on it and passed it down across 2 generations before the last of the Calvert Calloways, a woman named Harriet, had died in 1937 without children and left everything to a niece in another state who had no interest in the land and sold it to the first reasonable offer that presented itself, which turned out to be Arthur Greer. What James Pelham told Ruth next was the part he had not thought about in years because Leonard had not asked him to think about it after the initial deed review. The original deed, the one transferring ownership from the Calloway estate to Arthur Greer, had contained a notation, a property description detail that was common in deeds of that era and that most modern buyers and their lawyers noted and moved past without particular attention, because in the vast majority of cases it was simply historical boilerplate. The notation described the property boundaries and the structures included in the transfer and then added, in the careful legal language of the period, the words, including all subterranean structures and enclosures appurtenant to the above described premises, the nature and contents of which are known to the grantor and transfer herewith in their entirety. All subterranean structures and enclosures. Ruth wrote this down on her legal pad with the deliberate care of a woman who understands that the exact wording of a thing matters. She asked James Pelham what he thought it meant. He said what he thought it meant was that at the time of the transfer from the Calloway estate to Arthur Greer, there was something beneath the land that the Calloway estate was explicitly including in the sale. Something underground. Something with enough legal significance to warrant specific notation in a property deed. Something that had been there before the house was built on top of it. He also told her, and this was the part that settled into Ruth's chest with the particular weight of something important, that the deed had transferred intact through every subsequent sale of the property, including the sale to Leonard and Ruth in 1981. Everything on the land and beneath it, in the language of that original notation, had passed with each transaction. It had been hers for 43 years without her knowing it. It had been Leonard's before that. And before Leonard, Arthur Greer's. And before Arthur Greer, the Calloway families, going back to the late 1800s when the notation had first been placed in a deed by someone who had known what was down there and had decided to make sure the legal record knew it too. She thanked James Pelham. She wrote 3 more things on her legal pad after she hung up the phone, and then she sat at her kitchen table for a long time looking at what she had written without seeing it, because she was seeing something else instead. She was seeing a family she had never known and a house built on top of a secret and 50 years of ordinary life lived above something that had waited in the dark beneath the ordinary life the way certain things wait, without impatience, without urgency, in the particular stillness of things that are old enough to understand that time is not their enemy. She needed to know about the Calloways. The Calvert County Historical Society operated out of a building on Merchant Street that had once been a dry goods store and that still smelled faintly, in the back rooms where the older records were kept, of the cedar and dry paper smell of things long stored in spaces that hadn't changed much since the storing began. Ruth had been a member for 20 years, attending the quarterly meetings with the mild enthusiasm of someone who found local history genuinely interesting without being consumed by it. The woman who ran the research room on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons was named Phyllis Bowen, a retired schoolteacher of 68 who possessed the specific and formidable quality of a person who has spent decades learning where everything is and is therefore capable of finding anything you need in roughly a third of the time you would expect it to take. Ruth arrived on a Thursday morning with her legal pad and the notation from the deed, which James Pelham had emailed her at her request, and Phyllis Bowen looked at what Ruth had brought and set down the cup of tea she had been holding and gave the materials her full attention in the way of a woman who recognizes when something is actually worth her full attention. The Calloways, Phyllis said after a moment, were a family she knew. Not personally, but from the records, and from the particular residue that old families leave in a small town's institutional memory, the kind of residue that surfaces in the deed books and the church records and the letters that get donated to historical societies by grandchildren who are cleaning out houses and don't know what else to do with boxes of paper that feel too old to throw away. There was a box, Phyllis told her, that had come in 7 or 8 years ago from a family in Tennessee who had been descendants of Harriet Calloway's niece, the one who had sold the land to Arthur Greer in 1939. The family had found the box in the back of a storage unit after the niece's daughter died and had sent it to the Calverton Historical Society because the return address label they found with it had the society's address, and it seemed like the right thing to do. The box had been catalogued and shelved but not extensively reviewed, because the Historical Society received more material than its volunteer staff could process thoroughly and because the Calloway family, while locally significant in their time, had not produced anyone famous enough to make the box a research priority. It sat on a shelf in the back room with a catalog tag and had been waiting for someone to have a reason to open it. Ruth, apparently, was the reason. Phyllis brought the box from the back room and set it on the research table and removed the lid with the practiced care of a woman who handled old things regularly enough to have developed the right instincts about them. Inside, arranged in the careful layers of someone who had once organized them with intention, were the kinds of materials that tell you about a family's inner life rather than its public record. Letters, tied in bundles with faded ribbon. A household ledger, its entries in a small, precise hand that Ruth recognized immediately as the handwriting of a woman who kept accounts because keeping accounts was how you kept a household running and you understood this without being told. Photographs, the old kind, stiff and formal, with the faded sepia quality of images that had been capturing light since before living memory. And at the bottom of the box, beneath everything else, a document folded into quarters and wrapped in a piece of oilskin cloth that had been tied shut with a cord so old it parted at a touch. Phyllis looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the oilskin document. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Ruth unwrapped it carefully. The oilskin had done its work. The document inside was in better condition than it had any right to be given its age, the paper yellowed but intact, the ink faded but legible in the afternoon light coming through the research room window. It was a letter, handwritten, dated October of 1901, addressed to no one specific but written in the tone of something intended to be found rather than sent, the tone of a person recording something they needed to record against the possibility that time would otherwise erase it entirely. The writer was a man named Edmund Calloway, Harriet's grandfather, the patriarch of the family in its most established years. He wrote in the careful, formal prose of an educated man of his era, and what he wrote was about the land. Ruth read it twice before she was sure she understood it correctly. Then she read it a third time to be certain she was not adding meaning that wasn't there. But it was there. Edmund Calloway had written about a structure beneath the land on what was now Meridian Lane, a structure that his own father had built in the 1860s during a period of significant regional uncertainty, a structure designed with the specific purpose of preservation, of protecting certain things that the family valued from circumstances they could not predict and might not survive. He wrote that the structure had been sealed in 1889 after the last time it had been accessed, sealed in a manner he described as intended to be permanent unless the right person found the right occasion to open it again. He wrote that he had told no one outside the immediate family and that the immediate family had, by 1901 when he was writing this, reduced itself to his daughter Harriet, who was 11 years old and not yet ready for the information, but who would be told when the time was right. Harriet had died in 1937 at the age of 47 without ever having children and without, as far as Ruth could determine from what was in front of her, having left any record of what her grandfather had told her. Whatever Edmund Calloway had said to his 11-year-old daughter about what was beneath the land had either never been said, or had been said and kept, or had been said and forgotten, but it had not been written down and it had not been passed along in any form that had survived. The niece who sold the land to Arthur Greer had known nothing. Arthur Greer had built his house on top of the sealed structure without knowing what he was building on top of. Leonard and Ruth had lived above it for 43 years without the faintest notion of its existence. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Ruth sat with the letter in her hands in the Calverton County Historical Society research room and felt something she had not expected to feel on a Thursday afternoon in March, which was the precise, clarifying sensation of a door she had not known existed opening inside her, not the door in the basement, but the door in her own understanding of what the house on Meridian Lane actually was. It was not simply the house where she had lived for 43 years. It was the house where a family had kept something safe for over 100 years. Something worth keeping. Something worth sealing. Something that had been waiting in the dark beneath her kitchen, beneath her floors, beneath the ordinary busy surface of her ordinary busy life, for someone with the right occasion to come along. She asked Phyllis if she could have a copy of the letter. Phyllis had already reached for the scanner. There was one more thing in the box that Ruth noticed as Phyllis was copying the letter. At the very bottom, in the corner Ruth hadn't fully examined, something small and wrapped in a square of dark flannel. She reached for it with the permission of Phyllis's nod, and unwrapped it carefully, and found inside a key. It was old iron, heavy for its size, the kind of key made to work a substantial lock rather than a decorative one, with a simple bow and a long barrel and a bit cut in a pattern that Ruth did not recognize but that looked, to her eye, like it had been made for a specific and purposeful mechanism rather than an ordinary door. It was dark with age but not corroded, the flannel having preserved it from the worst of what time does to iron, and when Ruth turned it over in her fingers it felt solid and deliberate in the way that things made to last tend to feel. She looked at Phyllis. Phyllis looked at the key. They both looked at it for a moment in the particular silence of two women who understand they are looking at something that has been waiting to be found. The key had been in the box with the Calloway family papers. The box had come from the family of the niece who had sold the land. The niece had sold the land without knowing what was beneath it. Which meant either that she had known about the key and not known what it was for, or that the key had been in the box without her knowledge, placed there by Harriet or by someone before Harriet in the particular hope that the right person would eventually find it alongside the right information. Edmund Calloway's letter. The key to what Edmund Calloway had sealed. Ruth wrapped the key back in its flannel. She looked at Phyllis with an expression that must have communicated something significant, because Phyllis nodded slowly and said, very quietly, "Well. Just that." Well. Ruth drove home to Meridian Lane with the copied letter on the passenger seat and the key in the inside pocket of her jacket, pressed against her ribs the way you carry something that feels too important to leave anywhere less certain than your own body. She felt, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this, something she had not expected to feel at this point in a grief that had barely had time to settle, something she recognized after a moment as purpose. The clean, specific, forward-leaning sensation of a woman who has identified something worth doing and has the capacity to do it. She had felt it in the early years of her marriage and in the years of raising her children and in the library work she had loved, and she had felt it less as the ordinary life of an ordinary aging woman had quieted around her in the ways it does, and she was feeling it now, on a Thursday in March, with an old iron key against her ribs and her husband 2 weeks in the ground and her daughter's realtor waiting for a call. She did not call the realtor. Vivian called on Friday morning, which Ruth had anticipated. The call had the particular quality of a call that is presented as a check-in but is actually a progress report request, and Vivian managed the transition from one to the other with the practiced smoothness of a woman who has been doing it her entire adult life. She asked how Ruth was feeling, how she had slept, whether she had thought any more about the conversation they had on Tuesday. Ruth said she was feeling well and sleeping adequately, and yes, she had been thinking about the house. Vivian heard something in this that was different from the responses she had received on Tuesday and was quiet for a moment in a way that told Ruth her daughter was recalibrating. "I want to make sure we don't miss this window," Vivian said. "The market is doing something particular right now, and David being the realtor, David says that if we list in the next few weeks we are in an ideal position to get significantly above asking." Ruth said she needed a little more time. Vivian's voice went careful in the way it went careful when she was managing her impatience, which she had been doing since she was 8 years old and had learned from Ruth herself that the people worth persuading generally responded better to patience than to pressure. More time to do what? She asked. To think, Ruth said. To understand the house properly before I make any decisions about it. There was a silence. Vivian said she would call again next week, and Ruth said that was fine. She had a week. She understood this with the practical clarity of a woman who had been reading Vivian's timelines for 50 years. Vivian would give her a week, maybe slightly more, before the quality of the calls changed from management to insistence, and insistence from Vivian, once it arrived, had the particular momentum of something that did not pause for reflection. Ruth did not intend to still be in this position when insistence arrived. She intended to have opened the door in her basement by then, because she understood instinctively, with the certainty that comes from living inside your own knowledge of a situation, that whatever was behind that door would determine everything that came after it. She needed help. This was the second honest thing she told herself that Friday after hanging up the phone, the first having been the acknowledgement of purpose on the drive home from the Historical Society. She needed help with the practical dimension of what she was about to attempt, specifically with the question of whether the stone door in her basement could be opened safely by a 77-year-old woman alone, and whether the key she had found in Phyllis Bowen's box was actually the key to the mechanism she had seen in the basement wall, and what she ought to do if the answer to either of those questions was more complicated than she hoped. Her neighbor on the south side was a man named Garrett Odom, who had lived next door to the Harmons for 19 years and who was, among other things, a retired stonemason who had spent 40 years working with the particular material that the basement wall and its sealed door were made of. He was 64 and still physically capable in the way of men who have done physical work their entire lives, and he had been Leonard's friend in the straightforward, uncomplicated manner of men who live next to each other for nearly 2 decades and share a fence line and a mutual respect and the occasional Saturday morning spent doing yard work at roughly the same hour. He had come to the funeral on a Saturday and brought food on the following Monday without being asked, which was how Ruth knew his qualities without needing to itemize them. She knocked on his door on Saturday morning. Garrett listened to what she had to say with the same quality of attention Leonard had always appreciated in him, without interrupting and without the expression of someone who thought the person talking was being unreasonable, which was not a universal quality in Ruth's experience and was one she valued specifically when she encountered it. When she finished, he asked 2 practical questions: whether the door appeared to have been sealed from the basement side or the other side, and whether the stone surrounding the seam showed any evidence of mortar having been added after the original construction. Ruth answered both questions as accurately as she could from what she had seen, and Garrett said he would like to look at it himself before saying anything more definitive, and would she mind if he came by that afternoon. He arrived at 2 o'clock with a canvas bag that contained a flashlight, a set of stone chisels in various sizes, a small mallet, a can of penetrating oil, and a level, and he followed Ruth down the basement stairs without commentary and stood in front of the shelving unit she had moved aside and looked at the stone wall with the focused, professional assessment of a man who has spent his working life reading stone. He looked at it for a long time. He ran his fingers along the seam in the particular way of someone whose hands know what they are feeling for. He used the flashlight to examine the lower corners and the joint where the seam met the basement floor. Then he stepped back and stood with his arms folded and said what he thought. The door had been sealed from this side. This was evident from the way the stone on the interior face of the seam had been worked, with the marks of tools coming from the basement outward rather than from whatever lay behind it inward. Someone had sealed it from in here, from Ruth's side, and had done so with considerable skill and considerable deliberation, using a technique of fitted stone and what appeared to be a clay-based filler in the seam that had hardened over the decades into something close to stone itself, but not quite. Not mortar in the modern sense. Something older and more organic that would respond, Garrett said carefully, to patience and the right tools. The mechanism, he said, examining the lower left corner where Ruth had identified the seam most clearly, was interesting. Most sealed stone doors of this era used a simple pivot system rather than hinges, a central balance point that allowed the stone slab to swing inward if the locking mechanism was released. The locking mechanism would typically be a heavy iron bolt or pin system, accessible from one side only. He ran his light along the edge of the door where it met the frame and found, after a few minutes of careful looking, what he was looking for: a small iron fitting, corroded with age but intact, set into the stone at approximately waist height on the right-hand edge, half hidden by the filler material in the seam. A keyhole. Old iron, squared rather than rounded, the shape of a mechanism. Designed to receive a specific and intentional key rather than a general one. Ruth took the flannel-wrapped key from her jacket pocket and held it out to Garrett. He took it and looked at it without touching it yet, studying it in the light of his flashlight, turning it slowly to examine the bit. Then he looked at the keyhole. Then back at the key. He said, "I think that's it." Ruth felt something move through her that was not quite excitement and not quite fear but occupied the space where both of those things would have been if she had been a different kind of woman. She was the kind of woman who moved through significant moments with steadiness rather than expression, who felt the large things fully and privately and let them settle into her before she spoke about them. She stood very still in her basement with the old iron key in Garrett's hand and felt 43 years of this house rearranging itself around her into a shape she hadn't known it had. The clay filler in the seam needed time. This was Garrett's assessment delivered with the practical specificity of a man who knows that wanting something to happen faster than it can happen safely is the most reliable way to cause damage. He would apply penetrating oil to the seam and work it slowly over the course of several days, loosening the filler material a section at a time without putting stress on the stone or the mechanism, which was almost certainly seized with rust and age and would require careful preparation before the key could be turned without risking breaking it. A broken key in a century-old lock in a sealed stone door was the kind of problem neither of them wanted to create. Patience was what the situation asked for and patience was what it would receive. Ruth asked him how long. He thought about it with the judicious care of someone who does not like to give estimates he cannot stand behind. 3 days, he said, maybe 4. If they worked on it each afternoon and let the penetrating oil do its work overnight. He would come after lunch each day and they would do it properly. Ruth said that was fine. She said thank you, and meant it with the fullness of someone for whom gratitude was not a formula but a felt thing. Garrett nodded once, in the way of a man for whom being useful to a neighbor in genuine need is not a notable act but simply what you do when the occasion presents itself. That evening, after Garrett had gone home and the basement was quiet again, Ruth went downstairs alone. She stood in front of the stone wall with the shelving unit pushed aside and the outline of the sealed door visible in the light of the single bulb overhead. The penetrating oil Garrett had applied to the upper section of the seam had darkened the stone in a thin line along the edge, and the smell of it was sharp and purposeful in the cool basement air. She did not touch the door. She simply stood in front of it and looked at it with the steady, unhurried attention she brought to things she needed to understand. She thought about Edmund Calloway writing his letter in October of 1901, choosing to record what was beneath the land because he understood that memory was not sufficient for things that needed to outlast the people who held them. She thought about Harriet Calloway, 11 years old when her grandfather wrote that letter, possibly told and possibly not told, dying at 47 without children, the information going with her or going nowhere. She thought about the niece selling the land to Arthur Greer without knowing what she was selling. She thought about Arthur Greer building his careful craftsman bungalow on top of a century-old secret, his wide porch boards and his deep eaves and his floors that had darkened beautifully over 80 years. She thought about Leonard, who had known this house better than anyone and who had looked at the deed language with James Pelham 20 years ago and moved past it the way everyone moved past the things that did not yet have a reason to be examined closely. She thought about Vivian, who had walked through this house on the Tuesday after the funeral and seen a property to be liquidated, an estate to be settled, a problem to be managed efficiently before anything could go wrong. Who had arranged the rental vehicle and carried out the mahogany dining table that had been Ruth's mother's and put it in safekeeping and spoken to a realtor and left a brochure on the kitchen counter with the certainty of a woman who believed that what she could see was the whole of what there was to see. Ruth put her hand flat against the sealed stone door. She felt the coolness of it and the age of it and the specific resistance of something that had been closed for a very long time and did not yet know it was about to be opened. She stayed there for a moment in the quiet of her own basement, in the house that had been hers for 43 years and that was, she now understood, more hers than she had ever fully known. More layered and more various and more patient than the ordinary surface of it had ever suggested. More worth staying for. She said goodnight to it, which she was aware was an unusual thing to do and which she did not feel the need to explain to anyone, and went upstairs to make herself dinner and to sit at the kitchen table with her legal pad and add to her notes the things she had learned that day, because Ruth Elaine Harmon had always believed that writing things down was how you held on to them, and she was not about to stop believing that now. 3 days, Garrett had said. Maybe 4. She could wait. She had been waiting, it turned out, for much longer than that. The waiting, she thought, was nearly over. It was the 4th day. Garrett had come after lunch as he had promised, each afternoon without fail, working the seam with the patience of a man who understood that the cost of rushing old stone was damage you could not undo. He had worked section by section from the top of the sealed door down to the floor, applying the penetrating oil in careful passes and then working the clay filler with the smallest of his chisels in increments so deliberate they were almost imperceptible, and Ruth had stood nearby each afternoon and watched without interfering because she recognized that what Garrett was doing required the kind of focused attention that commentary would only interrupt. They had spoken during the pauses, about the house and about Leonard and about the Calloway family and what Edmund's letter had said, and Garrett had listened with the quality of attention that Ruth had come to understand was simply how he was, the same quality Leonard had recognized in him 19 years ago across a shared fence line. On the 4th afternoon, Garrett straightened from the last section of the seam, set down his chisel, and looked at the door with the appraising eye of a man who has done what he set out to do and is satisfied with how he has done it. He said he thought it was ready. He said it quietly, without ceremony, the way he said most things, and Ruth felt the word land in her chest with the specific weight of something that has been a long time coming. The key went in smoothly, which surprised her. She had expected resistance, had expected the lock to fight her the way the rest of it had fought Garrett's careful tools across 4 slow afternoons, but the lock had been made by someone who understood mechanisms and understood preservation, and the penetrating oil Garrett had worked into the keyhole over the past 2 days had done its quiet work. The key turned with a heaviness that was not difficulty but simply the weight of an old iron mechanism doing what it had been built to do after a very long time of waiting to be asked. She felt the bolt release inside the stone, a solid and definitive sensation that traveled from the key through her fingers and up her wrist in a way she would remember for the rest of her life. Garrett put both hands flat against the stone door and pressed steadily inward, not forcing it but applying the patient, even pressure of a man who has done this kind of thing before and knows the difference between persuasion and force. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, with a sound that was part stone and part air and part the exhalation of something that had been holding itself closed for more than 100 years, the door moved. It swung inward on its pivot mechanism in the slow, heavy arc of something massive and deliberate, and the air that came out from the other side of it was cool and dry and carried a smell that Ruth could not name precisely but that reached into the oldest part of her memory and touched something there, something about age and preservation and the particular atmosphere of spaces that had been sealed away from ordinary time. Garrett handed her the flashlight. She understood without him saying so that this part was hers. She stepped through the door. The space beyond it was not large. It was perhaps 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, stone-walled on all sides with the same careful fitted limestone of the basement foundation, the ceiling low enough that Ruth could have touched it by raising her hand above her head. The floor was packed earth, dry and firm beneath her feet, and along the walls on both sides ran a series of wooden shelving structures, built from heavy timber that had darkened with age to near black but had held its integrity in the dry sealed air the way good timber does when it has been kept away from moisture and rot. The flashlight moved slowly across the shelves and Ruth moved with it, and what she saw there she looked at for a long time before she was capable of saying anything at all. There were trunks. 3 of them, old traveling trunks with iron hardware and leather strapping that had stiffened with age but had not crumbled, set on the floor along the back wall with the careful positioning of things placed by someone who expected them to stay exactly where they were put for a considerable period of time. On the shelves, arranged with a deliberateness that was evident even after more than a century, were wooden boxes of varying sizes, sealed with fitted lids, and between them, wrapped in layers of oilskin cloth, flat rectangular shapes that Ruth recognized after a moment of looking as framed paintings, a dozen of them at least, stacked carefully with cloth between each one to prevent contact. She opened the nearest wooden box with hands that were entirely steady, because Ruth Elaine Harmon was the kind of woman whose hands did not shake at the moments that mattered. Inside, nested in dried material that had once been something softer and had compressed with time into a firm packing, was silver. Flatware, serving pieces, a tea service with a pot and creamer and sugar bowl of a weight and quality that told you without needing to be told that the family that had owned them had been a family that understood the difference between objects made to impress and objects made to endure. Each piece was tarnished black with age, the way silver tarnishes when it has been sealed away from air for generations, but beneath the tarnish was the unmistakable density of the real thing. The second box held coins. Not a casual collection but a deliberate one, gold coins of various denominations from the mid-19th century, arranged in paper rolls that had partially deteriorated but had kept their contents intact, and beneath the coins, wrapped individually in cloth, a series of gold pieces that were not currency but something older and more personal, jewelry, a woman's pieces, rings and brooches, and a necklace of a craftsmanship that suggested they had been made rather than purchased, made by someone. For someone specific, with the particular intention of endurance that runs through everything in this room. She opened the largest trunk last. Inside, beneath a layer of folded textile that had survived the century in the sealed air with a remarkable degree of integrity, were documents. Land records, the older kind, written on heavy paper in the formal script of the 19th century. Letters, bundled in groups and tied with cord that had dried but held. And beneath the documents, something that made Ruth sit down on the packed earth floor of the sealed cellar without making a conscious decision to do so, because her legs made the decision before her mind caught up to it. It was a painting, unframed, rolled carefully in oilskin, and when she unrolled it with Garrett's help, who had stepped through the door quietly at some point without Ruth registering exactly when, it was a portrait. A woman, painted in the style of the mid-19th century, formal in composition but alive in the face in the way that the best portraits of that era managed to be alive, the subject looking directly at the viewer with an expression of composed intelligence that reminded Ruth, immediately and without her choosing to be reminded, of the expression she had seen on her own face in the mirror on the morning she had stood in her kitchen and decided she was not going to Pinebrook Senior Living. On the back of the canvas, in the same small precise hand Ruth recognized from the household ledger in Phyllis's box, was a name. Eleanor Calloway. 1861, Edmund's mother. The woman who had built this room, Ruth understood in that moment with the particular certainty of a thing that simply becomes obvious once you are standing in the right place to see it. Not Edmund, not his father, but Eleanor. A woman in 1861, in a region of Virginia about to become one of the most contested landscapes of the next 4 years, who had understood what was coming and had done what capable women have always done when they understand what is coming. She had prepared. She had sealed her family's valuables in a room of her own making, and she had sealed it so well that it had outlasted the war and outlasted her son and her granddaughter and every subsequent owner of the land above it until a 77-year-old widow from Calverton had stood in her basement with a flashlight and an old iron key and refused to leave her own house on someone else's timeline. Ruth sat on the floor of Eleanor Calloway's cellar and felt the full weight of it, not as a burden but as a presence, something that had been waiting with the patience of a very long time for someone with the right combination of stubbornness and need and willingness to look carefully at the things other people had walked past. Vivian came on Saturday. She had called Friday to say she was coming, in the tone that meant the week she had given Ruth was concluded and the conversation that had been deferred could not be deferred any further. Ruth said Saturday was fine. She did not tell Vivian why Saturday was fine. She simply said it and let the silence after it carry whatever weight it chose to carry. Vivian walked into the house with the realtor's paperwork in a folder under her arm and the expression of a woman who is prepared for a negotiation she expects to win, and Ruth sat her at the kitchen table and poured her coffee and sat across from her with her hands folded in the way she had been sitting at this table for 43 years. And she told her daughter what she had found. She told it the way she told all important things, without drama and without embellishment, with the specific and careful accuracy of a woman who knows that the facts, accurately reported, are sufficient on their own. She told Vivian about the seam in the basement wall and the Historical Society and Edmund Calloway's letter and the key wrapped in flannel. She told her about Garrett and the 4 afternoons of careful work and the moment the bolt released. She told her what was on the shelves and in the trunks and rolled an oilskin on the floor of a room that had been sealed since 1889. She told her about Eleanor. Vivian listened without speaking. This was unusual enough for Ruth to register it specifically, because Vivian did not often listen through an entire account without redirecting it somewhere. But she listened, and as she listened the folder with the realtor's paperwork remained where she had set it when she sat down, closed, untouched. When Ruth finished, Vivian looked at her for a long moment. The expression on her face was not the expression Ruth had expected and could not quite be named as any one thing, because it was several things occupying the same face at the same time, the particular complexity of a person who was being required to revise something they had been very certain of. She looked at her mother, really looked, in the way she had not looked on the Tuesday she had come with the rental vehicle and the realtor's name and the organized efficiency of someone who had already decided what the situation was. She said, very quietly, "I didn't know." Ruth said, "I know you didn't." There was a silence between them that was different from the silences they had been living inside for the past several weeks, not the silence of managed disagreement but the silence of two people who are standing on the same ground for the first time in a while and are taking a moment to feel its steadiness. Vivian looked at the folder. Then she pushed it to the side of the table in a gesture that was small but that Ruth received as the thing it was, a concession that cost something, made by a woman who did not make concessions easily. She asked if she could see it. The cellar. Ruth said yes. She led her daughter downstairs and through the stone door that Eleanor Calloway had sealed in 1889 and into the cool dry air of a room that had been keeping faith with its contents for longer than their family had existed, and she watched Vivian stand in the flashlight's reach and look at the shelves and the trunks and the oilskin-wrapped paintings with the expression of someone who has just understood the full dimension of something they nearly caused to be lost. Vivian reached out and touched the edge of one of the wooden boxes and then withdrew her hand, as if she understood that touching required permission in a room like this. She said, "What will you do with it?" Ruth thought of Eleanor painting her portrait in 1861 with a war coming and a room already built beneath her feet, thought of Edmund writing his letter in 1901, thought of the key in its flannel square in a box that had traveled across decades looking for the right pair of hands. She thought of Leonard, who had lived above this room for 43 years and who would have loved knowing it was here. She thought of what it meant to be a woman who stays in her own house on her own terms and finds out what the house has been holding for her. She said, "I'm going to stay. And I'm going to find out what Eleanor meant for this to become. Whatever that is, it will take time to understand it properly. But I have time. I have this house and I have this room and I have time." Vivian looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she said the thing that Ruth would carry with her long after everything else about that Saturday was finished. She said, "You are not who I thought you were." She said it with wonder rather than criticism, with the specific wonder of someone discovering that the person they believed they knew completely has, all along, been considerably more than that. Ruth said, "I know, sweetheart. I'm glad you're starting to see it." James Pelham arranged for a specialist from Richmond to assess the cellar's contents over the course of 2 visits in April. The silver was authenticated and valued. The gold coins were catalogued and appraised, their rarity and condition placing them in a category that the specialist described with professional restraint as highly significant. The paintings were examined by a conservator who confirmed 2 of them as works of demonstrable historical and artistic value. The documents in the trunk proved to be original land records and personal correspondence of sufficient historical significance that the Calvert County Historical Society, in partnership with the Virginia Historical Archives, expressed immediate interest in access and preservation. Ruth did not sell a single piece. She opened the cellar properly, with Garrett's help and a structural engineer's guidance, creating a safe and permanent access point from the basement. She had the contents documented and conserved. She established a relationship with the Historical Society that gave them research access in exchange for resources that helped her stabilize and maintain what Eleanor had built. The financial value of the cellar's contents, when it was understood in its full dimension, was enough to resolve every uncertainty about the house on Meridian Lane for the rest of Ruth's life and beyond. But that was not the thing that stayed with her. The thing that stayed with her was Eleanor. A woman whose name had not survived in any record that anyone had thought to keep. A woman who had understood in 1861 what she was facing and had responded not with fear but with preparation, not with retreat but with preservation, sealing away what mattered in a room so well made that it outlasted everything that came after it by more than 100 years. A woman who had been overlooked by history the way certain women are always overlooked by history, quietly and completely, until someone opens a door and finds what she left behind. Ruth sat on her front porch on a morning in late April when the yard had returned to green and the birds Leonard had always fed were back at the feeder she had kept filled through the winter, and she felt the house behind her the way you feel a thing you have come to know in its full depth, not just its surface. She felt Eleanor in it. She felt Leonard in it. She felt herself in it, 77 years old and entirely, stubbornly, irreversibly at home. The house on Meridian Lane was not just where she lived. It was what she had stayed for. And staying, it turned out, had been the most important decision she had ever made. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.